Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy. I want to talk to you about the fundamental hip hinge. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I always say how the hip hinge is a fundamental foundation that everyone needs to own. We still hear the myth too often that deadlifting is bad for your back and that deadlifting heavy is really detrimental for back health, and it's a myth. The problem with deadlifting is that most people do it wrong. As a matter of fact, I've had people come to see me who are deadlifting 400 or 500 pounds, and suddenly they develop back pain, and when I assess their hinge, their basic hinge pattern, it's all over the map, right? So your body will survive to a dysfunctional hinge pattern for some time and still allow you to deadlift heavy, but at some point it'll break down. The same thing goes for if you do have back pain, it's still a movement that you need to own, and while you may not hope to deadlift 500 pounds depending on what's going on with your lower back, it's still a fundamental pattern that you need to own. The problems that I see with the hip hinge are most of all lack of timing of the hips and the torso. So a lot of the time people project a lot of the load into their lower back, and that's a technical issue, and you'll tell me that's a technical issue with the deadlift, and yes, it may be, but it's also an awareness issue with where the hips should go, where the shoulders should go. It's also a matter of people doing what sometimes people call squatty deadlifts. So people letting the knees pitch forward on a deadlift. And what happens if you let the knees pitch forward on the deadlift? Could you do like a semi-deadlift position for me? And then let your knees come forward like a squat on your deadlift. So what's gonna happen here is most of the time your knees will extend first. So as you lift up, it'll push you back. And then now all the load is on the lower back, right? And you've got now a lot less, if you come up from there, a lot less contribution from the hip extensors, glutes, and hamstrings because of the initial position of letting the knees pitch forward. So that's another problem that I see. Where the knees should go, where the hips should go, and where the shoulders should go are the main issues I see with dysfunctional hip hinges that contribute to low back pain or the low back getting too much load. So two exercises that I really like to use to reteach the hip hinge are the kneeling hip hinge and the band pull through for various reasons, which we'll go through. So first, the kneeling hip hinge is a super valuable exercise to time the movement of the hips with the movement of the shoulders, where my hips should go and how my shoulders move because of where my hips are going, and how movement is driven through the hips and not through the torso extension. So we're trying to put the focus on hip extension as opposed to having the focus on stand up with the bar, which would make me focus more on extending my torso and project a lot of the load more on the lower back. So let's look at the kneeling hip hinge. We get in a kneeling position, so tall kneeling position with the feet flat. A dowel will help them understand where the shoulders should go. So I often use a dowel. You may or may not decide to use it. The dowel option works pretty well with most people that I work with. So we're gonna let him lead with the hips, but the shoulders come forward so that shoulders always stay slightly in front of the knees, and come back up from there and down. Good, and up. Now the key thing here is that if the hips stop moving back, the shoulders need to stop moving forward. So if his hips stop here and he keeps bringing the shoulders forward, see how that is completely different and will project a lot more load into his lower back. So the kneeling hip hinge is a great activation or even an integration exercise to get connected with where my hips should go relative to my torso and my shoulders. It's obviously not an intense exercise, it's an awareness exercise, so you can go for 10 reps, you can go for sets of 20 and really work in that pattern. Good job. Second exercise that I like to use, now I want to reinforce that movement of the hips, that idea that my deadlift is led by the movement of my hips. So hips hinging back will create that tension in the hamstrings, and then hips come forward and the torso comes up as a function of my hips coming forward. I like to use the band pull through to reinforce that, because now I take my upper body and the path of the barbell just out of the equation. All he needs to do is hold on to the band, and I actually let the torso come forward quite a bit on the band pull through so he can really focus on pushing through the feet to bring the hips back forward. And that's what allows my torso to rise, because my hips are coming forward. So my torso rising, my shoulders rising because of my hips coming forward. I've connected with that using the kneeling hip hinge. Now I'm transferring it to the band pull through. So holding the band, moving forward to get some tension, feet hip width apart, parallel. And what he's gonna do is let the hips hinge back, let the torso come forward, and then he's pushing through the feet, bringing the hips forward. And shoulders come forward as a function of the hips coming forward. Good. And because all he needs to do is hold on to the band and let the band pull him back, he doesn't have to think about as much about where the bar is, where his torso is. He can really think about what's going on, push through my feet, bring the hips forward, and working into hip extension. Again, great activation or even an integration exercise. You could do very well with sets of 12 on an exercise like this. All right, so timing of the hips and torso. Focus on hip extension rather than trunk extension. Focus on the feet pushing through the floor to bring the hips forward are your main aspects that you need to work on to create a good hip hinge and take load off the lower back. Okay, and then deadlifts can be good for your back.